Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about the HOA boss who didn't realize that I am the CEO. Fate had a different plan for me, especially once I met the new head of the HOA, a gentleman named Marvin, who was about to complicate my life in ways I never could have predicted. The day I closed on the property, I barely spoke to anyone in the neighborhood. My real estate agent was the one who handled most interactions, including checking with the HOA for any special neighborhood regulations. Still, I knew it would be prudent to introduce myself, so soon after I moved in, I knocked on a few doors, said a quick hello, and gave out my contact information to any neighbor who asked. That's how I found out that the HOA was extremely strict about all kinds of activities: yard decorations, exterior paint colors, noise levels, and of course, access to certain community amenities that included a small lake and a designated birdwatching deck. I learned that no one was permitted to use certain vantage points without following a labyrinth of guidelines, effectively limiting who could be on specific lots at given times. I found it a bit over the top, but I figured it wouldn't really affect me if I just minded my own business. For a while, my visits to the mountain house were sporadic. My job required extensive travel, and I spent a lot of time at corporate meetings, conferences, and overseas events. You see, I'm the CEO of a mid-sized, well-respected company. We have enough influence that people who recognize the name understand it's a serious business, but we're not so large that every single person in the country would immediately be familiar with us. I enjoyed that balance. Enough prestige to be comfortable, yet enough anonymity to blend in when I wanted. Still, I made sure not to flaunt my position. It's always been my belief that humility opens more doors than boasting does. Things started to get interesting once I decided to spend a longer stint at the mountain house. I had a rare lull in my schedule, so I planned on staying there for a couple of weeks, maybe even a month, to recharge my batteries. One sunny afternoon, I was sipping a cup of coffee on my front porch, looking at the peaks in the distance, when I heard an authoritative voice call from the curb. It was Marvin, the new head of the HOA, as I'd later learn. He was standing by my mailbox wearing a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest and holding a clipboard. He was in his mid-50s, short, with a certain intensity in his eyes that made me think he'd been in charge of something his entire life. "Excuse me," he barked. "Are you aware of the new observation guidelines for our local waterfowl habitat?" I raised an eyebrow because that was not exactly the greeting I had anticipated, but I walked over anyway. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, trying to stay polite. "I only visit occasionally, so I may have missed something." Marvin tapped his clipboard. "We have regulations about the vantage spots from which homeowners are permitted to watch the ducks, geese, and other migratory birds down by the lake. You need special clearance to use certain angles of observation." He said this as if we were dealing with a high-level security breach rather than birdwatching. "I see," I replied, still confused. My property was on a slight hill, and from my backyard, one could see a portion of the lake if one looked through the dense foliage. It wasn't a perfect view, but you could spot birds during certain seasons. "Well, I generally just watch from my porch if I see anything interesting. I'm not sure how that requires any special permission," Marvin grunted. "It's a shared ecosystem. We have to ensure no one disrupts the breeding cycles of our local birds. Some vantage points are restricted only to official HOA members in good standing, and I'm the one who decides who qualifies for that. Since you haven't attended any of our monthly meetings, I have no way of knowing if you're up to date on procedures." From that moment, I realized that Marvin took his position extremely seriously. He seemed more concerned with asserting authority than genuinely fostering a neighborly environment. I wasn't going to start an argument. Instead, I said, "All right, I'll make an effort to attend the next meeting so I can learn the rules. Thank you for letting me know." He nodded curtly and handed me a pamphlet about bird protection guidelines, then strutted off like he'd just delivered a citation. It was odd, but I brushed it off and went on with my day. Over the next week, I noticed Marvin patrolling the neighborhood. He'd drive by slowly, sometimes park and walk around with that same clipboard, presumably making notes about anything he deemed out of compliance. One evening, I spotted him standing on the edge of my driveway, peering into my backyard with a pair of binoculars. When I confronted him, he claimed he was just doing his job, making sure no one was feeding the ducks illegally. I told him politely that if he needed to check my property, he should make an appointment or let me know in advance. He seemed indignant, but he left, saying he'd consider the protocol. A few days later, I got a notice in the mail, apparently from Marvin, though it was printed on the official HOA letterhead. It stated that I was not in compliance with certain landscaping rules because I had overgrown shrubs that might obscure critical viewing angles for fellow residents who wish to watch the ducks from the roadside. I actually laughed out loud when I read it, because the shrubs in question were hardly overgrown. They were neatly trimmed, in fact, but yes, they were tall enough that they blocked part of the lake view from the road. I suspected that was the real issue. Marvin wanted a better line of sight into my backyard, or possibly the lake, and my greenery interfered with his vigil. To keep the peace, I decided to trim them slightly more, but I made sure to consult the local ordinances first. According to my research, as long as the plants were on my property and didn't extend onto public sidewalks or roads, I was within my rights to keep them as tall as I wanted. Nevertheless, I trimmed them a bit, partly to remove any friction and partly because I figured it would keep me off Marvin's radar. It turned out my small act of cooperation did nothing to diminish his sense of entitlement. The second I complied with his request, he escalated. One morning, I was outside raking leaves when he marched up my driveway, exclaiming that it was critical he gain immediate access to my rear deck. I asked why in the world he needed that, and he told me in a dead serious tone that the ducks were beginning a new migration pattern, and as the head of the HOA, I require certain vantage points to monitor the species. It's urgent, and you have no choice but to comply. He kept waving a folder full of documents, presumably to make himself look official. I'd never heard something so absurd, but I also didn't want a confrontation. I calmly asked, "Why do you need my particular vantage point? Isn't the communal birdwatching deck in a better location?" He gave a rehearsed sigh. "That deck is exposed to the elements, and I need to observe them from a warmer spot. Your deck is covered, and the temperature is more tolerable. Plus, the layout of your backyard means I can see right where the ducks like to huddle." I doubted this was the real reason. It felt like an excuse to snoop, but he went on, "It's not just me, you know. This is important research for the betterment of our neighborhood." However, something about his expression told me that was a flimsy excuse. He then lowered his voice and said, "If you don't grant me access, I might have to file a violation for refusing to cooperate with an HOA directive." I stood there, stunned. I knew the HOA had some authority within the community, but I was fairly certain no part of its bylaws required an owner to give a board member unlimited access to a private deck. I responded, "Let me see the rule that grants you that right. If it's not in the bylaws, I don't have to let you in. And if you come onto my property without my permission, that's trespassing." He scoffed, pointed a finger at me, and said, "You'll regret this." Then he stomped away, leaving me with a knot of frustration in my stomach. I decided it might be time to dig more deeply into my legal rights as a homeowner in that neighborhood. I called a friend of mine who's a real estate attorney. She confirmed what I suspected. There was no clause in any standard HOA rulebook that gave the head of the HOA free rein to enter a homeowner's deck for personal reasons. She also advised me to keep a paper trail. If Marvin persisted, I should document everything and, if necessary, threaten a restraining order if he actually trespassed. Shortly thereafter, Marvin began sending me letters citing non-compliance with community observation guidelines, and he even included fictitious penalty fees. Each notice grew more outlandish. One letter read, "Due to your refusal to assist with essential waterfowl conservation efforts, you are subject to a daily fine of $50 until you provide lawful access to your covered deck." Another threatened that I would lose the privilege of parking in my own driveway if I didn't comply. Naturally, I knew these fees had no real legal basis, but they were a nuisance. I also worried that the constant harassment would escalate to the point where I'd have to involve the authorities to keep him off my property. Throughout all this drama, I happened to recognize something about Marvin that made me stifle a laugh whenever I saw him. I realized I knew his daughter, Susanna, because she worked for my company. However, Marvin had no idea about the connection. He probably didn't even know where I worked, nor did he care. But I knew Susanna relatively well. She was part of the marketing department, a bright and friendly woman who'd been with us for about 2 years. I'd met her a few times at corporate gatherings and had found her to be quite competent. We'd never had an in-depth personal conversation, but I had enough rapport to strike one up if necessary. I just never imagined I'd have to use this connection in the middle of a property dispute with her overzealous father. Meanwhile, the situation at the mountain community worsened. Marvin started telling other neighbors that I was uncooperative, selfish, and possibly against conservation. Some neighbors, especially those who disliked Marvin's tactics, sympathized with me and tried to give me a heads up whenever he was on a rampage. One neighbor, Greg, told me that Marvin held a small meeting to discuss how to get me to either give in or face consequences. Apparently, Marvin used his position to threaten me behind my back, but Greg assured me that several neighbors were tired of Marvin's antics. They'd had enough of his micromanaging. However, fear of fines and harassment kept them silent. I did my best to remain calm. I was no stranger to high-pressure situations thanks to my career, but it's one thing to navigate corporate negotiations, and another thing entirely to deal with someone threatening to barge into your private property with binoculars to watch ducks. The absurdity was wearing me down. Finally, I decided to request an official meeting with the HOA board, at which I planned to bring a lawyer if necessary. I was done playing Marvin's game. I wrote a formal letter to the HOA board outlining my concerns about Marvin's behavior, his unauthorized attempts to access my property, and the questionable fines he was trying to impose. I had it delivered to the entire board, not just Marvin. In that letter, I hinted that I was prepared to take legal action if the harassment didn't stop. To my surprise, I got a response from the vice chair of the board who promised to look into it, though she didn't elaborate on what would happen next. During this waiting period, Marvin showed up again one weekend afternoon, flanked by 2 other HOA members. He declared in a booming voice that I had one final chance to comply, or else they would move forward with drastic enforcement measures. He demanded that I open my back door and allow him, along with these 2 silent supporters, to roam around my deck. "We need to look at the ducks in warmth with binoculars," he declared, "and you have no choice but to agree." When I tried to speak, he cut me off. "Don't fight this or you'll be sorry. You're obstructing official HOA duties." That was the last straw. I took out my phone, started recording video, and said, "If you step onto my property without my permission, I'll be calling the sheriff. I'd also like you to state on camera exactly why you think you have a legal right to come onto my deck." Marvin's cheeks turned red, but he was still defiant. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said. "You're just some homeowner who thinks you can hide behind fancy threats." I almost laughed at the irony of that statement, given that I was the one with actual legal counsel on speed dial, but I kept my composure. At this point, I had something better than an immediate call to law enforcement. A strategic phone call to someone who had more sway over Marvin than he could imagine, his own daughter, Susanna. Before responding to Marvin's latest outburst, I excused myself and stepped inside. He and his minions shouted after me, claiming I was running away, but in reality, I just needed a moment to privately make the call. I dialed Susanna's work number. Since it was a weekend, I wasn't sure if she'd pick up. To my surprise, she answered after a few rings, explaining she was catching up on a project for an upcoming campaign. I told her, "Susanna, this is your CEO. Sorry to bother you on the weekend, but I've encountered a situation involving someone close to you. It's personal, but I need your help. Are you available to speak briefly?" She sounded both surprised and worried, but she said yes. I stepped back outside with my phone in my hand. Marvin was still there, looking smug, assuming I was calling the police. In front of everyone, I said, "Marvin, there's someone on the phone who would like to speak with you." At first, he refused, suspicious that I was setting a trap, but eventually he grabbed the phone. I put it on speaker, and Susanna's voice came through, greeting him politely. "Dad, is that you?" The look on Marvin's face was priceless. His jaw literally dropped. He stammered, "Susanna? Why are you... How do you know what's going on?" She calmly explained that I was her company's CEO, the head of the organization she'd been proud to be a part of for 2 years, and that I was the last person in the world with whom Marvin should be playing power games. Marvin's eyes went wide. It took a second for him to process that the man he'd been harassing was none other than the person who signed his daughter's paychecks. I ended the call with a friendly but firm note. "Susanna, thank you for clarifying matters. We'll discuss details later, but I hope your dad will understand that this approach to neighborly relations is unacceptable. I trust you'll talk with him." She told me she would, apologized profusely, and hung up. Marvin's face was beet red, and the 2 HOA members with him stood there, not sure whether to back away or keep glaring. They did a bit of both, apparently deciding that the confrontation had gone terribly off script. Marvin muttered something about how this changes nothing, but the trembling in his voice indicated otherwise. Within moments, he marched down my driveway and told his cohorts to follow. I stood there, taking deep breaths, not sure if I felt relief or a different kind of stress. Clearly, Marvin would now realize that if he continued to harass me, word could get back to his daughter, and by extension, it could have repercussions he probably never considered. I had no intention of firing Susanna. She was a great employee. But Marvin didn't need to know the nuances of my corporate policies. The mere possibility of harming his daughter's standing at work might be enough to keep him in check. Within a week, I received a formal written apology from the HOA board, signed by the vice chair, not Marvin, stating that the fines I'd been threatened with were invalid, that there was no official bylaw requiring me to give up my property for personal birdwatching, and that they would review Marvin's conduct as the head of the HOA. Meanwhile, neighbors began telling me that Marvin had scaled back his patrols. He wasn't as vocal at community gatherings, and it seemed that he was rattled by the near disaster he'd created for himself. One neighbor told me about a meltdown Marvin had at the most recent HOA meeting. Apparently, he tried to justify his actions by claiming I was obstructing environmental research, but the board shut him down with documented evidence that his claims were baseless. Some neighbors had come forward with their own stories of how Marvin had tried to force his way onto their properties for various minor reasons. A wave of discontent was forming, and people were beginning to question whether Marvin was fit to lead. If this were the end of the story, it would be satisfying enough, but there was more. I found out through Greg, my supportive neighbor, that Marvin was actually pursuing another angle to get me to leave the neighborhood. He had previously convinced a few board members to pass a new regulation requiring any modifications or usage changes to private decks to undergo an inspection. This was meant to ensure no one built an enclosure that blocked community visibility. Though this rule was originally introduced, ironically, to keep vantage points open for the birds, Marvin was trying to twist it into a reason to penalize me. He claimed that my covered deck was a modification not previously on record, and therefore I was in violation for having constructed something without a permit. My deck, of course, had been built years before I bought the house, so that argument didn't hold water, but Marvin was searching for anything he could cling to. I responded by hiring a private home inspector to verify the deck's compliance with local building codes. The inspector produced a thorough report confirming the deck was up to code and had existed for over a decade. I forwarded that to the HOA board. Meanwhile, I kept a close eye on Marvin's next moves. I suspected he was too humiliated to continue an outright war, but pride can do strange things to people. In a surprising twist, Susanna reached out to me at work about 2 weeks after the deck fiasco. She said that her father had been acting extremely contrite at home, constantly muttering about how he might have jeopardized her career. She wanted to personally apologize on his behalf, although I assured her that her job was not in any danger. I told her that I appreciated her courtesy and that I truly had no intention of letting this incident affect her. She admitted that her father could be overly enthusiastic about rules and was often oblivious to boundaries. I told her that, as far as I was concerned, we had resolved the issue. Although if Marvin kept pushing, I'd have to respond. She understood. As the next HOA meeting approached, there was talk of a recall vote. Several neighbors had grown tired of Marvin's authoritarian approach. They claimed he was abusing his position, causing the HOA to lose respect within the community and issuing bogus fines for personal vendettas. The board scheduled a special session to address these concerns. I attended, but mostly to observe. When the day came, the community center was packed. There were several points on the agenda, and Marvin himself sat at the front, looking both defensive and deflated. People aired grievances, from being fined for planting flowers in unapproved colors to having petty citations for leaving a garbage bin an inch beyond the designated boundary. My own story came up last, and I was asked if I wanted to speak. I kept it factual. I explained that Marvin had demanded access to my private property under false pretenses, threatened me with made-up fines, and then tried to force me into compliance under the guise of an important observation. I added that this entire saga could have been avoided if he'd simply respected homeowners' private spaces and followed the actual bylaws. Marvin mumbled a half-hearted apology. He tried to blame miscommunication, but the board members were unimpressed. Ultimately, the board decided to hold a vote on removing Marvin from his position as HOA head. The majority voted in favor of his removal, and he lost his seat that very night. He stood up, pushed his chair away, and walked out in a huff, ignoring the calls from a few supporters who still, for some reason, admired him. Once again, a wave of relief washed over me. Justice, in a sense, had been served. He wasn't going to be able to harass people with his made-up rules anymore. That alone might have seemed like punishment enough, but the next day, I heard from Greg that the entire fiasco had exposed a host of other questionable actions Marvin took while in office, including suspicious uses of HOA funds for personal projects. An internal audit was being done, and if anything illegal was found, it could lead to an official investigation. Greg joked that perhaps Marvin would end up with more time to watch the Ducks than he ever wanted, just from a less comfortable vantage point. I wasn't gleeful about the possibility of him facing serious consequences, but I certainly believed in accountability. Over the ensuing weeks, the neighborhood's atmosphere became more relaxed. People felt safer discussing community improvements without fear of random fines. A new HOA head was appointed, someone far more balanced. The board decided to reevaluate a number of Marvin's old policies, especially those relating to petty oversight of personal property. By the end of that month, we saw a reversal of several of the more absurd regulations. Life in the community improved dramatically. From a personal standpoint, the ordeal left me with a renewed appreciation for how property rights function in the United States. When someone tries to impose their will on your private space without legal backing, you have real recourse. And yes, it helped that I had a direct line to a real estate attorney. However, what truly disarmed Marvin was the simple fact that I knew his daughter. He never considered that I might hold a position of respect, or that his attempt to intimidate me could blow up in his face. It was a testament to how arrogance and ignorance often walk hand in hand. I also found it interesting that Susanna's role at my company ended up being the pivotal piece that resolved the standoff. If we hadn't had that connection, Marvin might have escalated further, and I'd have been forced to go through the courts or maybe even file police reports. While some might say I used my position as leverage, I never threatened his daughter's job or tried to influence her directly. All I did was put them on the phone together so he could see the bigger picture. That single moment, him hearing Susanna say, "Dad, you're harassing my CEO," was the ultimate reality check. In the aftermath, Susanna and I shared a few awkward smiles around the office. She seemed embarrassed by her father's actions, but I reassured her there were no hard feelings. We each went on with our professional lives as if nothing had happened. Though I occasionally heard from colleagues that Susanna avoided talking about her family, I couldn't blame her. With time, I think we all moved on. Despite all the chaos, I still love my mountain house. The area is breathtaking. The neighbors, most of them, are warm and friendly, and I can truly relax there in a way I never could in my main residence. Even the ducks that caused all the fuss continue to fascinate me on my quieter days. I watch them from my porch sometimes, though these days I do so without worrying about an intrusive man with a clipboard demanding to share my deck. It's funny how the very thing Marvin claimed was so important, birdwatching, ended up revealing his misuse of power and eventually led to his downfall as HOA head. Some have asked if I ever confronted Marvin again after he lost his position. The truth is, I've barely seen him. He apparently keeps a low profile now, maybe out of shame or maybe out of fear that further confrontation could stir up more trouble. Rumor has it that he's focusing on traveling, presumably to other places where he can observe wildlife without irritating a community of neighbors. And I assume the internal HOA audit was concluded, though I never heard the final outcome. Marvin certainly didn't contact me or provide an update. Not long after, we had a big neighborhood cookout, organized by the newly elected HOA head. It was a pleasant evening. Barbecue grills, lawn chairs, children playing, and a sense that the community was coming together again. I chatted with a few folks who told me how relieved they were to see Marvin gone. As it turned out, they had endured multiple run-ins with him and just didn't have the time, energy, or resources to fight back. Now, with a more reasonable board, the entire place seemed friendlier. We even discussed forming a volunteer group to maintain the public birdwatching deck and keep it stocked with the right educational materials. That was the kind of constructive, community-oriented approach that I believed an HOA should have from the start. On the corporate side, life went on as usual. My position as CEO meant that day to day, I was busy dealing with major business decisions rather than personal squabbles. Susanna continued to excel in her role, helping our marketing team land some impressive new contracts. She would nod politely at me in hallways or wave if we passed each other in the cafeteria. I never once brought up her father, and she never brought him up to me either. It was best left in the past. One funny postscript to this story is that Greg, my neighbor, joked about adopting a rescue duck and naming it Marvin. He laughed and said we could let it waddle around the backyard, ensuring it had free rein to stand on the deck as much as it wanted. He admitted it was somewhat mean-spirited, but the mere thought of a duck named Marvin policing the yard gave me a laugh. I told him if he ever did it, I'd at least provide the feed, though we both knew it was just a lighthearted fantasy. If there's any lesson to be gleaned from my experience, it's that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. Marvin presumed I was a pushover simply because I owned a home in his domain and lacked local connections. He saw me as an easy target for his enforcement spree. Little did he know my professional network and resources greatly exceeded what he was prepared to handle. He taught me an important lesson too. Never underestimate how far petty power holders will go to assert authority they don't actually have. If you stand your ground, gather evidence, and use the right tools, including legal measures if you have to, they often crumble when faced with real accountability. Throughout this ordeal, the biggest emotional hurdle for me was reconciling how a seemingly normal person could become so vindictive and irrational when given a taste of authority. I've seen it happen in corporate environments, but it struck closer to home, literally, when I encountered it in my own neighborhood. The difference is that in the corporate world, I'm accustomed to strategic negotiations and protocols to limit liability. In a residential neighborhood, the lines can blur more easily. People can feel personally attacked if their sense of control is threatened. That's exactly what happened with Marvin. In the end, I emerged unscathed. In fact, I ended up with a better community environment than before. I'd gotten to know my neighbors more intimately because of the shared adversity, and collectively we made changes to the HOA that benefited everyone. It's rare that a fiasco like this leads to constructive reforms, but I'm grateful it did. We replaced outdated and arbitrary rules with more transparent ones, and we installed an oversight system that prevents any single individual from wielding too much unchecked power. Ironically, we also improved conditions for those ducks that Marvin was so keen to watch. We set up a proper informational panel near the lake, which describes the species that frequent the area and outlines ways to help protect them without infringing on private property. What about Marvin's daughter, Susanna? She thrived professionally, earning a promotion several months later. She even led a successful marketing campaign that brought in a significant uptick in revenue for our firm. I never discussed her father's downfall with her again, but we maintained a respectful rapport. It was enough to know that she was not defined by her father's actions. If anything, she became even more dedicated at work, perhaps to prove she was her own person, separate from that fiasco. My story could have ended much worse if I had been less aware of my rights or if I had bowed to intimidation. It's easy to get bullied by individuals who claim to represent the official rules, especially when they have titles like head of the HOA. But in America, private property rights are significant, and an HOA can't just trample them on a whim. There are checks and balances, and sometimes it takes a bit of legal knowledge or the right phone call to ensure those checks and balances are enforced. Friends, thank you. See you soon.